1,700 years ago, early in the 4th century. There were a number of different Christian groups, and they had different ideas, and they all got together and met in a place called Nicaea, which is just outside of modern-day Istanbul. And they had a meeting called the Council of Nicaea, and they voted on what would be the core teachings of Christianity. Shri? That's from out there. They voted on what the core teachings of Christianity would be. And, bishops and well-respected members of the Christian church got together. There were a number of different belief systems. There were people who had the idea that Jesus was a man, was like a guru-type figure. And then there was the people who had the idea that Jesus was divine. And they ended up with something called the hypostatic union, which was that Jesus was both man and divine. There was a union of both divine and material qualities inhering within Jesus. It's a strange idea in many ways. But the fruit of that council and what they voted on has become the backbone of Christianity for 3 billion people. If you look at what came out of that, the Nicene Creed came out of that. Who's making the noise? Deal with it. You can work a little harder. Maybe pick her up, him up. What do we got there? We got a her. Yeah, just don't leave. Just a little bit. Just a little bit of effort. There you go. That's enough. Shh. They voted, and they came up with this thing called the Nicene Creed. It's a relatively brief set of teachings that encodes the basic beliefs that everyone in that group had agreed upon, and those people represented the entirety of the fledgling church. And they got together and they said, okay, this is what we believe in. This is what we agree upon. And the result of that was that over the last 1,700 years, that teaching has remained almost completely consistent. You have so many denominations. I was going to say a gazillion, but it's not quite true. You have a number of different denominations, certainly numbering in the hundreds, if not thousands. But if you look at the various denominations of Christianity, you'll find that 99.x% of them follow very strictly and adhere very strictly to the Nicene Creed. You follow this? So I'm just going to say it again because it was just way too much noise. But please listen carefully and we'll go through it quickly. About 1,700 years ago, just outside of Istanbul, all the leaders of Christianity got together and they voted. Democratically, they voted. Maybe some people got 2 votes. I don't know exactly how it worked, but they voted. and they voted on the core ideas that like what it meant to be a Christian. The Christians were a small group at this time. The pagans were way bigger than the Christians. The Christians were a fledgling entity. There was someone named Constantine, and Istanbul used to be called Constantinople, and it was named after him. He was a Roman ruler, and he prayed to Jesus and won in battle, and then he made Christianity the state religion of Rome, and that's how Christianity got popularized. Prior to that, paganism was all the rage. And the Greek gods had gotten adopted by the Romans and given Roman names, and that was the standard. And then it switched, and Christianity became the norm. And it got so popular, it's become the religion of half the world's population, almost, maybe 40%. And of the 3 billion Christians in the world, 99.9% of them, if you look at the Nicene Creed and you measure it up against what they believe, there's an incredible degree of uniformity. It's almost inconceivable, the level of uniformity they've been able to enjoy for over 1,700 years. It just doesn't happen. Groups start to drift in various directions, but such a large group of people with such a high degree of uniformity in terms of core beliefs, and those core beliefs are encoded in the Nicene Creed. We have this same thing in Hinduism. At a certain point, it wasn't in the very beginning, but at a certain point in Hinduism, there was this sutra phenomena that came up, where the teachings of a given school were written down in very, very succinct and terse aphorisms. Very, very succinct. Atato Brahma Jigyasa. Now, right now, inquire about Brahman. Jamadi Yasya Yataha. Brahman is, so now, right now, inquire about Brahman. And then the next thing that's said is Jamadi Asya Yataha. Jamadi Yasya Yataha. That Brahman is that thing by which everything is born. By which the universe is born. So Brahman is the word for God, the source of all reality. Then Shastra Yonitvat, from the womb of Shastra comes your understanding of that Brahman, because you can't understand it just on your own, and so your understanding will come from the womb of the scripture. That will give birth to your understanding. So Brahman gave birth to the world, but the birth of your understanding of that Brahman that gave birth to the world will be born from the womb of Shastra. Like, very, very terse statements. In fact, the statements are so terse, you can't understand them. You can't understand them just by reading the Sanskrit. You require a commentary. You look at like a sutra piece of literature, and there'll be just simple statements, really simple statements. The Yoga Sutras, same thing. Ata Yoga Anushashanam. Yogas Chitti, Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Tada Drashtu Swarupe Vastanam. That now begins instruction on yoga. Yoga is the curbing of the fluctuations of the mind. And at that time, then, the seer, the ultimate seer of reality, you are able to abide within yourself instead of being disturbed by the fluctuations of the mind. They're very, very terse statements with a minimum amount of grammar. But if you read the commentaries on the sutras, they're extensive. Hundreds of lines of commentary for a single line of a sutra. Sometimes thousands of lines of commentary for a single line of sutra literature. And what happened was the schools, they wrote down in extremely terse language the core of their beliefs. They would then be memorized by students, and then those students would receive significant amounts of instruction on what those sutras meant. But because they'd memorized the sutras, they were able to carry the entirety of the teachings of a tradition around with this mnemonic device of the sutras, and then they would remember all the commentary triggered by, stimulated by the sutras themselves. They would remember each word of the sutras, what those words meant, and all the numbers of different commentaries, and they would be carrying the entirety of a tradition with them. That's like a creed in our tradition. But the sutras, and the Buddhism has the, like the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, Sutta. They call them suttas in Pali, which is a village form of Sanskrit. And so sutra, which means thread, the thread that ties something together, is called sutta. And so if you look at Buddhist scriptures, they're all called sutta. And they're also these incredibly terse texts. You got, idam dukkha, this is suffering. Idam dukkha samudaya, this is the cause of suffering. Idam dukkha nirodha, this is the end of suffering. Idam dukkha nirodha gamini pratipad, this is the path that leads to the ending of suffering. That's the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. This is suffering. This material world, birth, death, old age, disease. This is the source of suffering. Your desire, tanha, which is trishna, thirst, desire, kam in Sanskrit. Trishna in Sanskrit, thirst or desire, that becomes the cause of your suffering. This is the end of your suffering. What's the end of your suffering? The ceasing of desire is the end of your suffering. And this is the path that leads to the end of your suffering, the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path. What is the Eightfold Path? It's like a sutra. Samyak drishti, proper vision. Samyak sankalpa, proper determination. Samyak vyayava, proper exertion. Samyak karmanta, proper action. Samyak ajiva, proper livelihood. Sankalpa, karma, jiva. It's 5. Samyak pragya, proper wisdom. Samyak samadhi, proper meditation. That's 7. I lost 1. Anyway. So you memorize. It's not my religion. I'm not a Buddhist. But you memorize these suttas, and then you receive instruction from a teacher on what they mean, and then you walk around with the sutras, with the suttas, and you know the tradition. And it was a way of regulating. It was a way of regulating a tradition and encoding its teachings so that they could live forever. And how successful are they? I don't know. The Fourfold Noble Truths of Buddhism, those are pretty well known. The Eightfold Path, pretty well known. I'm still trying to remember that. I can't help it. Still trying to remember it. Or the Nicene Creed. Most Christians don't even know the Nicene Creed, but it's become so standard that they believe it even without having studied it because it's all that's taught in the churches. Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, they all follow it. It's the core of the tradition. If you divert from it, arguably you're not a Christian. It's like stuff like Jesus was the Son of God. He was simultaneously divine and human. He died on the cross for your sins. If you believe in him, you'll have everlasting life. It's like those core teachings of Christianity. But the thing is, if you make a sutra or a Nicene Creed, there's a certain inelegance to it. And the inelegance is you now have a separate piece of literature telling you what your primary literature teaches. Did you follow that? Let me say it again. If you write a sutra to encode the beliefs of your tradition, and the sutra says Shastra Yonitvat, from the womb of Scripture you will learn this. In fact, Sola Scriptura is a very, very famous statement by Martin Luther about Christianity, that you'll only receive faith sola scriptura, sola fide, by the Scripture, by faith in the Scripture, by the Scripture. And so if you're glorifying your Scripture as being the Word of God, but then you need a book written by someone else to understand and codify and systematize what's in your sacred text, what are you really saying about your sacred text? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Somehow it's divine, but it's not systematic. Somehow it's divinely inspired, but you can't understand it by yourself. In fact, you got to come and listen to me, and I'm going to tell you what your sacred text says. And there's a certain inelegance in that you need another book to tell you how much you should respect this first book. The first book isn't enough to garner your faith and fidelity and realization. Did you follow that? I think this is a pretty significant problem with sutras, with suttas, with creeds. So there's another phenomenon that takes place within our sacred tradition, and that is that within a given text, they will find a paribhasa sutra. They'll find a verse in the book itself, which is the cornerstone teaching. Ete changsap kalapungsa Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam is the paribhasa sutra of the Bhagavad Purana, one of our most important texts. Ete cha angsa kala pungsa. These are different parts and limbs, segments. These are different segments and parts of the divine being. Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam, but Krishna himself is himself the Supreme Lord. That's a famous text from the Bhagavad Purana. That all the avatars are angsas, they're parts, and kalas. Kalas, a segment of the moon. There are different parts, but Krishna himself is the Supreme. And that, they say, this is the Paribhasa Sutra. And there's another thing. There's a Chatu Shloki. There are 4 verses of a text, and those 4 verses are understood to represent the entirety of the text. This is a way the Vedic literatures themselves had of giving a sutra within the book itself, with giving a creed within the book itself, that you could study just a tiny part of the book and you could still understand the whole book. Now, to make a claim that this is a Chatu Shloki, this is the 4 primary verses of a text, it has to be shown that the rest of the text adheres to that and evolves around that and is consistent with that. The Bhagavad Gita has such a Chatu Shloki, 4 verses. And of the entire Gita, every school I've ever read, and there are, dozens of primary commentaries on the Gita, every school says this is the Chatu Shloki. There's no other argument for what the 4 primary verses of the Gita are, and which is what we're going to read today. So let me say it again, relatively quickly, because you guys all will remember this now. I just want to get us all on the same page. Please listen carefully. Creeds are a way of a given group of people to put down in a succinct format the core of their belief system, so anybody can understand it. And you cut out all the chaff, and you're left with just the wheat, just the kernel, none of the husk. Just the rice, none of the bran. The core of your tradition. And in fact, that happened in Christianity with the Nicene Creed in 324, 325 AD in Nicaea, outside of Istanbul, which used to be Christian. We think of Istanbul as being Muslim, but that's just since the Ottoman Empire. Before that, before the Ottoman Empire, Hagia Sophia, which means highest wisdom, was a church. It was the biggest church in the world. Now it got turned into the Blue Mosque. But before the Muslims conquered it and turned it into the Blue Mosque, it was the biggest church of Christendom, the largest church. It was the heart of the Eastern Church. There was a Western Church in Rome and the Eastern Church in modern-day Turkey. And everybody was Christian. The Muslims came in and converted everybody and took over the places of worship. So the Nicene Creed, and this Nicene Creed is phenomenal in that 1700 years later, 99.9x% of the world's Christians follow it, whether they even know it or not. Protestants follow it, Catholics follow it, Orthodox follow it, The Coptic Church follows it. Everybody follows it. The followers of Arius don't follow it, but they've all died out. They died out 1,600 years ago. Everybody else follows it. 3 billion people, 40% of the world's population. The same thing is there in Hinduism. Vedanta Sutra, Yoga Sutras, Mimamsa Sutras. It was these terse aphorisms, these threads, very, very simple verses with incredible amounts of commentary. There's an inelegance to both creeds and sutras. Buddhism has suttas. I gave you some examples. Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, they all do this because there's a need to codify and systematize a belief system, a theology. But there's a certain inelegance when you look at all these things. And that is that you're having to read another book and have faith in that other book to understand your primary book. But your tradition is all based on your primary book, but it's understood that you can't understand that primary book on its own, and it's inelegant, and it doesn't have an internal coherence, and therefore you need another book or another set of teachings to define what you believe, and so you're left with a crazy, chaotic deity who can't explain himself, so he needs human beings to explain what he actually means, or you're left with, I have to have more faith in that book to have faith in this book, and now I have to have faith in the Nicene Creed more than my faith in the Bible, which goes against core statements in the text itself. Did you guys follow that? So if you can find the core teachings in the book itself, that's even better, and we have that. And that's called the Paribhas Sutra, the one verse in an entire text, which tells you the whole text. And there's another version of it called the Chatushloki, the 4 verses that tell you everything in the text. The 4 verses that tell you the entirety of the tradition. And the Gita has that. And, there's 700 million Hindus in the world, and 600 million of them venerate the Gita. And there are no competing versions of the Chatushloki. This is the one. And if you know these 4 verses and you read the rest of the Gita, you will find that the entire Gita revolves around these verses. It revolves around these verses. There's also Paribhas Sutra in the Gita. No one ever calls it that, but there's only one verse in the Gita which is repeated twice. And it's in the exact center of the text, hidden like a gem in the exact middle. The exact middle of the book. The Gita has 18 chapters. The exact middle of the book is the last verse of the 9th chapter. The exact middle of the book. That book happens then, and then at the end of the book. And Krishna says, this is my supreme teaching, this is my highest teaching. Guhyatamam, it's the greatest secret. Paramam Vacha, my supreme teaching. And it's the only teaching he repeats twice. But we're not going to study that today. We're going to study the Chatushloki today. So it's 4 verses. And we're going to go through them all. Please listen carefully as we go through them. I want to go through them in their entirety because there's a certain beauty to going through them in their entirety. Aham sarvasya prabhava mata sarvam pravartate iti madva bhajante mam buddha bhava samanvita machitta makata prana bodhayantas parasparam katayantas chamam nityam tushanti cha ramanti cha tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam pritipurvakam dadami buddhi yogam tvam yenamam upayanti te tesham evanukam partam aham agyana jam tamaha nashayam yatma bhavasto jnana dipena bhashvataha. Aham sarvasya prabhavo mata savam pravartate iti ma vabhajante mam buddha bhava samanvitaha machita makata prana bodhayantas parasparam katayantas chamam nityam tushanti cha ramanti cha tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam pritipurvakam dadami buddhi yogam tvam yena mam upayanti te tesham evanukam partam aham agyana jam tamaha nashayam yatma bhavasto jnana dipena bhashvata. Aham sarvasya prabhava. I'm the origin of everything. Mata sarvam pravartate. Everything proceeds from me. Iti matva bhajante mam. Thus knowing this, they worship me. Buddha, bhava samanvit, those who are wise, thus knowing this, worship me, filled with love. Matchitta, matkata prana, those whose minds are dedicated to me, those whose lives are dedicated to me. Bodhayantas parasparam, they're always enlightening one another about me. Katayantas chamam nityam, they're always talking about me. Tushanticha ramanticha, they find satisfaction and ecstasy in this. Tesham satata yuktanam, for those who are always yoked to me. Bhajatam pratipurvakam, and for those who are always worshiping me with love. Dadami buddhi yogam tvam, I give them the intelligence, yenamam upayantite, by which they can approach me. Tesham evanukam partam. For the purpose of showing compassion to those who worship me always. Aham agyana jam tamaha, I, the darkness of ignorance, the darkness born of ignorance, nashem, I destroy it. Atma bhavasta, situated within them, which could either refer to the ignorance or the Lord. Jnana dipena bhashvata, with the shining lamp of knowledge. I am the source of all material and spiritual worlds. Everything emanates from me. The wise who perfectly know this engage in my devotional service and worship me with all their hearts. The thoughts of my pure devotees dwell in me. Their lives are fully devoted to my service, and they derive great satisfaction and bliss from always enlightening one another and conversing about me. To those who are constantly devoted to me, serving me with love, I give them the understanding by which they can come to me. To show them special mercy, I, dwelling in their hearts, destroy with the shining lamp of knowledge the darkness born of ignorance. These are 4 verses. Sometimes I'll ask for commentary on these verses. I'll ask you to tell me what these verses mean, why these verses would be considered to be a chatushloki, the 4 most important verses, why they form a creed within the text itself, why they encapsulate the entirety of a tradition. In fact, why don't we do that? We did okay. We're halfway through class. I've been going for 28 minutes. We got through it. What do these verses say to you? What did you learn from these verses? Let me say them again. I'm the source of everything. Everything comes from me. The wise who know this engage in my loving devotional service. Their lives are dedicated to me. They're always thinking about me. They're enlightening one another about me. They're always talking about me, and they get great pleasure and satisfaction by doing so. For those who are always dedicated to me and serving me with love, I give them buddhi yoga, yoga of enlightenment, by which they can come to me, and to show them special mercy, I, whom dwelling within their hearts, destroy with the shining lamp of knowledge the darkness which is born of ignorance. Those are the 4 verses, translated literally, and we translated now 3 times. And so you've understood what a chatushloki is supposed to do, encapsulate an entire tradition. It's supposed to be big, the cornerstone idea. I gave you examples of that in other traditions. What do these verses say to you? Yeah.
It describes the nature of the world and its relationship to God.
Okay, the first thing laid out in the verses, the first one is, I'm the source of everything. Everything emanates from me. That might sound redundant, which of course wouldn't be a problem. If somebody says, I'm the source of everything, that's a pretty big statement. You can say it twice for emphasis. However, there is a technical point which is being made. According to Sankhya literature, there is both the Upadan Karan and the Nimitta Karan of creation. There is the matter of the universe, and then there is the energy by which the universe is animated. And so Krishna is claiming both positions. He is the stuff of the universe, and everything is empowered and animated by him. So he's making this claim that he's both matter and spirit. He's both cause and effect. He's both matter and energy. He's both the active as well as the static cause of existence. The remote and the direct cause. That's what's being said here. And so that's the first thing that Krishna does, is he lays out a piece of knowledge about himself. That's correct. And that's an important thing. Why is that important, Drew?
It forms a foundation of existence.
It forms your foundation of existence. That is true. Yes?
Because if we're wanting to be talking about a religious text, we need to know that there's a God.
All right, it establishes that there is a God. It gives you knowledge of God, not just a foundational truth, but a theistic foundational truth. That's great. There's more. What else? Why else is it important to establish Krishna's Bhagavatva, his godhood, from the very beginning? What comes next? I'm the source of everything. Yes.
We're going to be talking about us, and so if we're going to be talking about us, we also need to be able to know what his relation to would be Krishna.
How are we going to talk about us?
That's what happens next in the verse.
What happens next in the verse?
That we give back to Krishna.
Okay, that isn't talking about us so much. It's talking about our relationship with God. The verse does not highlight that the souls are my eternal parts. That is taught in the Gita, but it's not taught in this section. What does happen is, now that you know that God is the source of everything, the cynosure, the center of all existence, then it becomes the most natural thing in the world to be related to Krishna, to be devoted to Krishna, and you have a reason to worship Krishna because he is the Supreme Lord. So you have to give people a reason to worship God. Look at the structure of the first verse. I'm the source of everything. Everything comes from this. The wise who know that engage in my loving service. The result of having to know him is to love him, is a statement in the Bible. To know him is to love him. If you know who Krishna is, then naturally you'll be devoted to Krishna. If you don't know who Krishna is, how could you reasonably be devoted to Krishna? And what would be the depth of such devotion? God has to be identified and articulated prior to there being a natural attraction or worship of God. You see how you got close? More thoughts on the verses. Yes.
I feel like one of the goals.
By the way, to make it easy, you can ask me to repeat any portion of the verses, and I'll do that for you. It's like an open book test, and I'm the book. So if you need, you can ask me, and I will mention, the section that you're trying to comment on, and to make it right there in front of you, so it's easier for you to contribute. Yes.
I feel like one of the goals of the tradition is to think about Krishna at all times and want to go back to Krishna.
Sure. So a very, very core teaching taught all over the Gita is that we should think about Krishna, want to attain Krishna, want to go back to Krishna, going back to our source, going to the highest realization, the ultimate reality, and this is articulated in these verses. It would be hard. You'd be hard pressed to say this represented a core of a tradition and not have something that spoke about attaining Krishna or moving towards Krishna. Excellent, good point. More, yes.
It goes into the way we should serve Krishna with devotion, not just simply with love.
Think about the verses. Okay, that's good. Yes. Well, it's interesting. It says the wise, Buddha, comes from Bud in Sanskrit. It's where you get the word Buddha from. It means the enlightened one. Buddha means the enlightened one. So this says Buddha, Bhava Samandit, the wise, Iti Matva. Having known this about me, the wise, Bhajante Mam, they worship me. Bhajante, this is where you get the word bhakti from. Bhajante, from Bhaj. Bhajante Mam, they worship me, Bhava Samandit, with great feeling. Endowed with great feeling. So it's interesting because you get both a philosophical devotion. You're a Buddha, you're enlightened, you've been enlightened by this knowledge, but then there's also an emotional devotion. And there's a joining together. Normally you find a tradition will either tend towards intellectualism, sometimes called Gyan in Sanskrit, Vidya, or it'll tend towards a more emotional, devotional approach, bhakti. But you find in this verse in the Gita, both things are united together. By that knowledge, you become devoted, and you're not merely knowledgeable or enlightened, but you're enlightened and you're also a lover of divinity. And so you find both those terms put together. That's what you're trying to say? Okay. I was hoping you were going to say something else. The next verse then explains that devotion. The first verse says, you become devoted to me. The next verse says what that consists of. Your thoughts are in me. Don't nod your head yes. Unless you get raising your hand, you don't get to nod your head yes, because you didn't know the answer. Only way I know you know the answer is if you raise your hand. Otherwise, you're just a cheater trying to get credit for something you didn't do. Your thoughts are about me. Your life is dedicated to me. This is a definition of how you are devoted to Krishna. You're enlightening one another about me. You're always talking about me. And what's the result of that devotion? Tushanticha ramanticha. You find great satisfaction and even ecstasy by doing so. You become spiritually joyful. You become spiritually joyful. Did you follow this? Okay. I'm the source of everything. Everything comes from me. Having known this, you'll become devoted to me with all your heart. How am I devoted to you? Your thoughts will be with me. Your life will be dedicated to me. You'll talk about me. You'll think about me. You'll enlighten other people about me. You'll help other people come close to me. And what will be the result of that? You'll feel great ecstasy and great joy. Tushanti, you're very satisfied. Charamanticha, and they feel also great bliss, pleasure. Ram is often used to communicate sexual pleasure. It indicates a very, very intense pleasure. Not just satisfaction, but actually intense pleasure. From talking about and thinking about and dedicating your life to Krishna. So the first two verses outline who is God, what is your response generically, and then what is your response in detail, and what is the result of that response. More, yes?
He's also forming a reciprocal relationship. So he's saying, if you do this, then I will cleanse your heart with the knowledge of the life.
Excellent. Perfect. So now, the first two verses are about God's existence and our response to God's existence. The next two verses are about reciprocity. But they're not merely about God's reciprocity with us. They both begin with the word tesham, which means for them. Tesham, for them. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam pritipurvakam. For them who are always yoked to me. For them who worship me according to love. Dadami buddhi yogam tom. I give them enlightenment. Yena mamupayante, by which they can approach me. Tesham, for them. So this is what Krishna is going to do for us. Evanukampartam. Kampa means to shake. Anukampa means to shake for another. It's a Sanskrit word for compassion. Teshan evanukampartam. For the sake of compassion for them. Literally, I'm shaking for them. Aham jnana jam tamam nashayam yatma bhavasto jnana dipena bhashata. With a shining lamp of knowledge, I dwelling in their hearts, destroy the darkness born of ignorance. So these verses are a reciprocity. First, you get happiness just from worshiping Krishna. But then he personally reciprocates with you in two verses. And that reciprocity is indicated by the usage of the term tesham. For them, who have now dedicated themselves to me, I then do these things. More. Excellent point. That was the next point to make. Excellent point. There's another point to make. What is it?
That in that reciprocity, Krishna empowers devotees to enlighten each other?
No. That happened before he mentioned the reciprocity. Bodayantas parasparam, enlightening one another, katayantas shamam nityam, and always talking about me, is in the second verse. The tesham verses are 3 and 4. But there is an empowerment that happens. To those who are devoted to me and worship me according to love, I give them the understanding by which they can come to me. How does Krishna empower you? Yes.
Cutting out the darkness in your...
Let me say it again. I give them the intelligence by which they can come to me. How does Krishna reciprocate with you? By empowering you. I give them the intelligence by which they can come to me. What is Krishna giving you? I mean, what's wrong with you people? Come on. I handed it to you on a silver platter twice. How did you miss that? You have multiple master's degrees. How can you miss that? It's basic grammar. You were enlightened in the beginning because you knew Krishna was God. You are Buddha. But then, Buddhi Yoga Dadami, I'm giving you further enlightenment by which you can come to me yet again even closer to me. And so there's a reciprocity where God's existence gives rise to some inspiration for you to reach out to divinity. And then by you reaching out to divinity, you enjoy a certain amount of happiness. But then Krishna involves himself with you and gives you more understanding by which you can then make another foray, another advancement to a higher level of devotion. Can you see it? It's very clear, isn't it? What comes next? What comes next?
The Krishna will destroy the darkness in their heart.
There's a certain amount that you can't do on your own. That Krishna giving you intelligence is not enough to completely solve the riddle of the Sphinx, the riddle of the universe. And so Krishna, in addition to giving you more empowerment and more enlightenment by which you can come towards him, at some point he also has to personally take care of some of it. And he says, out of compassion for you, I destroy the darkness of ignorance with a shining lamp of knowledge. He's now personally getting involved. It could be considered to be redundant and a further evolution of him giving you enlightenment. But he says he's destroying the darkness born of ignorance in your heart. And so he's personally getting involved. And he's helping you. And so you get this back and forth. Krishna's existence is a tacit, non-forceful way of inspiring devotion. He's not pushing you. Then you respond to that knowledge that there is a source of all creation by becoming devoted. And Krishna gives you specific ways through your thoughts, through your actions. There's a cognitive element, mat-chitta, and there's a behavioral element, mat-gata prana. Your life is dedicated to me, that's a behavioral element, and you're thinking about me, that is a cognitive element. And then in between cognition and behavior, there's a third thing. What is it? Speech. Speech exists. Kaya, manas, vacha. You have your body, your mind, and your words. Western thought doesn't say this. You just say cognitive behavioral therapy. But speech is kind of in between. It's a type of a behavior, but it's not a full behavior. But it's not merely cognition. It's somewhere in between. It's a linkage between your thoughts and your actions. So mat-chitta, you think of me. Mat-gata prana, your life is dedicated to me. And then bodhayantas, you talk about me and you enlighten one another about me. So now you're responding in specific ways to Krishna's divinity. But Krishna's divinity isn't forcing you to do so. But now by doing that, you open the door, and now Krishna can involve himself more in your life. And now he can give you a further layer of enlightenment. Dadami buddhi yogam tam. He gives you that yenama upayati, by which you can make that further progress. And even more, he enlightens you from within your heart, destroys the darkness of ignorance. Like the sun destroys the darkness. The sun rising in your heart destroys the darkness. And there's a strong back and forth reciprocity in the last two verses. Because you've opened the door, because you responded to Krishna's being, which wasn't forceful. Krishna just exists. But if you become aware of that existence and you reciprocate with it, that opens the door for there to be a further exchange, a more deep layer of reciprocity. You open the door. You buy the course. You involve yourself. We did all that in 15 minutes. Not bad. I know I got a little fiery because I'm assuming like a certain level of cognition of the basics of the English language here. And when you put on the stupid hat for a second and can't hear the sentence which was just spoken to you twice, I'm going to reiterate it with a little bit of gusto to make that point sink. What else do the verses teach us? Yes?
Well, it really stood out to me as we were going through the last two verses and that reciprocity that, we have this all-powerful God, but his heart is captured by our devotion.
The word kampa, shaking, anukampa, shaking for another, which is the Sanskrit word for compassion. Anukampa. That Krishna has compassion for us. Compassion, interestingly enough, when you talk about love, oftentimes compassion is defined as love manifested towards someone who's suffering. Let me say that again. If love is a basic emotion, then depending on the situation of the person you're loving, you will feel different flavors of that same basic emotion of love. And so many theoreticians, many kind of framers of positive emotions within positive psychology, they point out that really compassion is love directed towards someone who's suffering. Amazingly, the word compassion is etymologically linked to the passion of the Christ. And the word compassion exists in the English language as to feel. Passion means suffering. The passion of the Christ is the suffering of Christ when he died on the cross. And compassion is to suffer with someone. Sympathy is a similar word, to feel with someone. Compassion is more direct, to suffer with somebody. Com means with. Compassion, to suffer with somebody. And so when you see someone suffering and you have love for them, then the act of them suffering makes you feel compassion. Pity is a very remote form. You see an animal suffering, you drive by and you have some fleeting thought. That's pity. It's not active. Sympathy, now you feel with them, you want to do something, but you might not know what they need because you're not really with them. You're feeling alongside them. Then empathy, you feel into somebody. Now you know what they need. And when you put sympathy and empathy together, that's normally conceived of as compassion. You know what they need and you want to do something to mitigate their suffering. And so empathy to know what they need and sympathy to want to do something, you join those two together and that becomes compassion. Now your ability to manifest compassion has a lot to do with your empowerment. You may feel for suffering people in Syria. A lot of suffering going on in Syria right now. But you may not be able to do anything about it. Maybe you're a homeless person on the street. You can't even feed yourself. What can you do? Maybe you think about them a little bit. But what can you do? But if somebody like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or even more Elon Musk, the biggest of them all, decides he wants to do something to mitigate the suffering of people in Syria, what can't he do? He can move mountains. So your ability to manifest compassion has a lot to do with your own abilities. Krishna's compassion towards us, which this verse is saying Krishna feels compassion for us, shakes with us, shakes for us, suffers with us. Of course, a deity that was devoid of compassion is not a deity I would want to worship. We usually think of absoluteness and remoteness and dispassion as being values. But that makes you a robot. A deity who is incapable of love, of empathy, of ultimately supreme relativity, of being able to be with you, would be at best an automaton or a robot. Wouldn't be a deity that warranted your full love. Only a deity capable of loving you back would warrant your full love. So you find this supreme relativity being described as part of Krishna's personality, that he feels for you. Of course, if an infinite being with infinite power feels compassion for you, then the way they can manifest that compassion is unlimited, and we call that grace. And so when you talk about divine grace, what you're really talking about is love towards someone who's suffering, compassion, as manifested by an unlimited being. That is divine grace. And that's in the verse too. Strongly in the verse. And so you have this really nice mixing of works and grace. It's kind of a very popular topic within Christianity. Is it by grace? Is it by effort? Is it by works or by grace? And you find both are articulated in these verses. So you've got something about Krishna's nature, something about our reciprocation with that, some specifics of what that devotion looks like in terms of being cognitive and behavioral, how that opens the door for further divine reciprocity and ultimately leads to a dissension of divine grace. You guys see it? It's an entire theology in 4 verses. Free will is honored. Bhakti is honored. How bhakti manifests. Preaching is honored. Opening a door for Krishna to give you more. An unlimited loop of reciprocity where you love and Krishna loves and you love and Krishna loves and you love and Krishna loves, and it goes on ad infinitum. The possibility of what we need to bring to the table in terms of our works, in terms of our effort, what Krishna brings to the table in terms of grace or mercy or kripa, karuna. It's all in there. More thoughts? Yes.
The part that you talked about, or you were speaking about the womb, where we're born out of ignorance.
Aham agyana jam tamaha. Tamaha, darkness. The darkness, what is it? Tamaha agyana jam. The darkness born of ignorance. Tamaha means darkness. It's the nominative, so it's the subject. And that darkness is agyana jam. It's born of ignorance. So, and Krishna says, nashayami. It's in the first person singular. I destroy it. So he's saying he personally involves himself in your life. Krishna uses this language in the Gita. Nashayami, vahami. I personally do this for you. And he says he destroys that. Jnana dipena bhashvata. Bhashvata means shining, brilliant. Jnana dipa. Jnana dipena. By the shining lamp of knowledge. I destroy the darkness born of ignorance in your heart. Because I am atma bhavasta. I'm situated in your heart. I can do that for you. Yes? You want to comment something further? I was giving you the verse so you would have it at your disposal. What do you want to say?
So ultimately, we were born with ignorance, and he's helping us to transcend.
Yeah, I mean, if you say we're born with ignorance, it starts to get into a little tricky theological territory. If you're born with ignorance fundamentally, this is called a corrupt soul theology. It's Augustinian theodicy, according to St. Augustine, early in the church, before the Nicene Council actually. He came up with this idea that everyone's born with immortal sin. But it's a simple thing. Could an all-powerful God create you without immortal sin? The answer is yes. He's all-powerful. Would an all-good God want to create you without immortal sin? Sure he would, because an all-good God would want to do that. Even I'd want to do that, and I'm not all good. So an all-good, all-powerful God would be able to create you without immortal sin, and he'd want to create you without immortal sin. So we say we're born with ignorance, it starts to become deterministic, and now God becomes responsible for all the evil in the world. So what the verse is saying is that the darkness is born of ignorance, and that ignorance was a choice you made by turning away from Krishna, because you have free will. Therefore, free will is acknowledged. But by that free will which allows you to turn away from Krishna, you can also turn towards Krishna. Instead of being Krishna Bahirmukh, where you turn your face away from Krishna, you can be Krishna Unmukh. You can turn your face towards Krishna. That opens the door for him to then be able to speak to you and to help you. And that puts the problem of suffering and evil and bad things on your shoulders because it was your act of free will as opposed to Krishna's. So the darkness is born of ignorance, not that you were born in the darkest of ignorance. You follow? That was created by some divine madness of a not all good or not all powerful deity. Did you follow that? That's how to skate on that one, how to walk that razor's edge. More? Yes.
I like how in 10:9 Krishna is describing the pure devotee.
Yes.
He's saying that they always think of me.
Yes.
And how that is very congruent with Krishna's ultimate instruction in the Gita to always think of me.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Manmana, think of me, is the Paribhas Sutra. The one verse in the Gita which is repeated twice is Manmana, think of me. Bhava Mad Bhakta, be my devotee. This is saying that in 4 verses. That verse says it in 1 verse, and it starts with this very, very simple notion. What makes a human being so amazing compared to animals? What makes us special compared to other animals?
You can think.
That's right. Very, very powerfully. We have a massive prefrontal cortex, and we're capable of really amazing, abstract, deep thought. And the proof of it is our incredible ability to speak, which is intimately linked to our ability to think. Human beings are distinct from animals in that they can think incredibly powerfully. Our nails are so weak compared to animals. Our fur is so weak compared to animals. Our digestive tract is so weak compared to animals. We are so weak. And we have to build fires and cook our food. I mean, no animals have to do that. But we can think. And so we were built to think. And so turning towards Krishna is as simple as beginning to think about him and ponder. And that's core in both the verses. Both the one verse in the entire Gita, the only verse spoken twice, and in these 4 verses. Machita. So it's a bahuvrihi samas, those whose lives are those who think of me, to those people who think of me. Madgata prana, to those whose lives are dedicated to me. And so Krishna's identifying who are the devotees, cognitive and behaviorally, but it starts with a cognitive feature because that's what it means to be a human, and we only find religion within human society. There's something special about being a human. It's not speciesist. It's not like racism. It's not specious. It's not against other species. There's just something that it means to be a human. You have this amazing power of thought, which leads to things like philosophy and religion and recursive language, all the defining features of human society, which distinguish us from every other species on the planet. And so a life of devotion begins with something as simple as a thought. Who can't spare a thought? Who can't turn towards divinity with a thought, even if only experimentally, even if only hypothetically? Krishna didn't even ask you for everything from the beginning. He asked you for a little bit from the beginning, which then opens the door for him to reciprocate and then more reciprocity from you. And so it's just a little bit of a willingness to get in the laboratory and do the experiment. Anyway, looking at world religion, looking at world religious literature, we find this phenomenon of creeds. We find this phenomenon of sutras and suttas. We find that traditions want to do this, and it's most elegant when you can find that codification within your sacred text itself, and we find that that does exist in the Gita. We went over these verses, and they're just pregnant with wisdom. What else do you need? The identity of divinity, your response, cognitive, behaviorally, your free will is being honored, that it's both intellectual as well as emotional, that it opens the door for reciprocity, that you help other people, that then Krishna is able to give you more enlightenment by which you can make further progress so that reciprocity doesn't stop and you continue moving forward in a helix, a circle which moves forward of divine reciprocity, and then Krishna ultimately steps in a way of divine grace which is not possible for you to build a stairway to heaven or a Tower of Babel. You're not able to do it all on your own, and even there's a place for divine grace, but not merely divine grace as a reciprocity with a full-fledged effort from our part. What else do you want? And a supremely absolute deity, the source of all existence, who's also supremely relative, whose heart is literally shaking for you. And beautiful poetry. The shining lamp of knowledge, destroying the darkness born of ignorance. Beautiful poetry is within the verse. Yes?
With I want to say, I think he's also establishing that he's going to be doing the heavy lifting. So he's already said, I'm matter and spirit.
Keep going, yes?
So he's already said, I'm matter and spirit.
Wait there.
Making it sort of
Wait.
easier for us to think about him. So if I say waterfall, I can think, oh, it's Krishna's work, or the waterfall is so good. So he's sort of making it easier for us and then doing the heavy lifting in the sense that I'm going to clean up.
Krishna's existence of creating this world for us, of giving us life, gives us a reason to be devoted.
Right.
And then divine grace means ultimately he does the heavy lifting for you. The beautiful point. Thank you very much. We'll close with that. Hare Krishna.